Hello, and welcome to episode 81 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave in Napa Valley.
Yeah, man, happy belated birthday. Let's start with that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, did you have a nice one?
It was good. Went up to Lake Tahoe, rented a house, stayed away from people, played in the snow.
Did you stay away from your family?
No. I had a lot of fun time with them.
That's good.
I like them, so it's easy to hang out with them.
I saw some sledding pictures of the little one. She looked like she was having fun.
She, at the end of the trip, said, "I want to move here now."
Now? Oh.
Yes, immediately. She was crying as we left, and I was like, "Look, we can come back. We only live like 3 hours from here." But that logic didn't work on her.
Well, what are you going to do? Well, I'm glad you had a good one. There's another holiday of sorts coming up that I know you and I are both a fan of, and it has inspired our drink choices today. Nothing terribly original on tap.
No.
But happy early St. Paddy's Day. What are you drinking?
I am clearly going to be drinking Guinness for St. Patrick's Day, and I'll be disappointed if you aren't.
Well, I won't disappoint you yet, because I am drinking Guinness as well. Although I spice mine up a little bit with a shot of Jameson beforehand, less so for the holiday, more so for the topic for today's talk.
You want a little pain in your drink? Is that what you're saying?
I actually want a little numbness in my drink. Yeah, I'm trying to dull the pain of what we're about to discuss.
Then add some Baileys and do it all as a big shot.
All right, if we take an intermission in this podcast, I'll go remix.
Just a word of advice for anybody out there, should they ever encounter me in a bar, I love to drink Irish car bombs. So you can always approach me with one of those and be met with a welcoming smile.
You're quick on them too, which is impressive. That's my judge of most people's character, how fast they can down an Irish car bomb.
It's the only time I can drink Jameson and actually like the taste of it. So it's probably because of the Baileys, and I love Guinness, which is just fantastic to me. So I'll take it for what it is.
There you go. Yeah, I think the last time you were down here in L.A., all of us partying together, we had a few, from what I can recall.
We've talked about this before because it often ends the night in so many different ways.
Yeah, the curtains close.
What is the topic for tonight, John?
Well, today, we're going to talk about this particular admission cycle and specifically why it is that it's so brutally competitive.
Yes. And it's, I think, a dark episode in that sense, because the news here is not very happy for people who are in this application cycle. So we'll get deeply into that. But I imagine that we would have made some song choices based upon the pain that is to come throughout this period. So what did we choose for the music here?
Yeah, choices plural. In fact, we couldn't quite narrow it down to one, so we picked a handful of depressing songs, all around this theme of just sort of suffering. One is the great late Johnny Cash, his cover of I think it's a Nine Inch Nails song originally, a song called Hurt, that Nine Inch Nails put out years ago and Cash covered more recently.
Which is odd, because I said to you earlier, I was like, usually it's Johnny Cash puts out a song from, years ago, and then people cover it.
Mm-hmm.
Here, it's reverse, and he takes the Nine Inch Nails version, which I think you labeled as screamy.
Yeah, a little bit. Trent Reznor doing his thing.
Which I don't think is inaccurate. And I'm not a big Johnny Cash fan, but his version of this song, I think, is actually outstanding. It's very dark.
Mm-hmm.
Works really well. So it's actually two different versions of the same song, but when the song that we've chosen is called Hurt, you can probably figure out that thematically things are going downward here.
Yeah, so one song, one theme, two takes on it. There you go. I suppose, we'll do the LSAT world, but time's a waste and we got a lot to cover. Let's dive into this thing.
Yeah, let's talk about the LSAT world. And the first thing is that since we last had an episode, the February LSAT scores are out, and we're going to postpone the conversation on this till a little bit later in this conversation because those numbers are really central to what we are looking at here. So we'll come through them. I don't think overall that it was a test that was overly challenging in terms of the results. It reminded me quite a bit of tests of last summer, where all of a sudden I saw a slew of high scores and people writing me with messages to the effect of, I just got a 178. That's higher than anything I've ever gotten. I had scores all over the 170s. And when I started to see that on Wednesday morning, It concerned me because we know we have a high score bubble, and I figured that they would probably try to keep this in control somewhat, but it was clear to me that that didn't happen here. And I also saw the same thing I saw during the summer, which is as many high scores as there were, there's always a number of people who had a really bad score reversal. I saw this online quite a bit, -10, -6, these kinds of drops. And I don't know why the Flex does this, but it did it during the summer when this whole bubble was created. And it's happened again with that February test.
Yeah, I was going to say, it wasn't universally good news here in February. Largely, but not universally.
As we'll see, though, February is added to the scoring bubble that already was extant, and that's a concern. So we'll come back to that particular point. How's that April LSAT looking, though?
Well, first, let's just celebrate that March is a month off. That's a moment of deep satisfaction and joy for me. But the April LSAT is going to come in looking enormous, frankly. I think the latest numbers that you and I saw on it were over 34,000 people registered for that test. I think like 34,720 some odd number. And that number changes by the day as people withdraw or other people get confirmed. But it's going to be a big one. In fact, I think as of early registrations for it, or registrations today, it's the biggest Flex test yet.
That is correct. And the numbers will continue to come down because you can no longer register for that test, but people will withdraw. The big question is how many will ultimately withdraw on this. But 34,000 as a registration number is far greater than anything that we've seen so far. So this is going to be a big test. And one question I've gotten, especially from people who are looking ahead, is they know the dates are a Saturday and Sunday, and they keep asking whether or not they will add more test days. The answer is for sure they will.
Yeah, absolutely.
I believe they'll add 2 more test days, giving a total of 4. Those test days will probably be Tuesday and Wednesday, most likely. That gives them a day off in the middle on Monday. But they'll detail that probably about 10, maybe 14 days at most before the April administration when they send out that message that says, these are the test dates, here's the registration, or really the time sign-up process. So we won't know for another month, maybe a few days less than that, what's actually going to happen there, 3 weeks or so.
Yeah, one of the things that actually put that number in perspective for me was looking back at this time of year last year. There wasn't an April test last year, but there was a February and there was a May. The February test was a little over 10,000 people registered. About 10,000 took it. The May test was around 9,500. So this test is over 3 times as large as what was happening this time last year.
Now, you remember April last year was affected by the pandemic.
That's right.
And the only people allowed to take April last year were the people who'd been registered for March, which was canceled. So that did affect, it wasn't an open registration test in April, but it tells you that March was small to begin with. And then people wanted to, try their hand at the new original test that they had. So
yeah, you flash back a year, and I mean, this is truly unprecedented and surprising, frankly. I don't think LSAC saw it coming. They announced this as a Saturday-Sunday test, and clearly that's not going to cut it.
But they did that for all the tests here. And I'm trying to get my timeline straight. Maybe it was April last year that got canceled, and it was May that ended up being small.
I think that's right. Yeah, I don't think there was a test last April.
You're right.
Yeah, I had a house guest all of last April, if I recall, and I don't remember interrupting that little fiesta for a test weekend.
We'll leave that
Yeah. No, that's as far as I want to go into it. But it's a big one, and I mean, as we start to run through the numbers about this cycle so far, and then take April on top of it, it really does serve to, I think, magnify the point.
Yeah, and I think it brings up an interesting question. Why is April so large this year? I think there's a couple different reasons we could look at. It used to be that April was very late in the admissions cycle, and I think that's been changing in recent years, where April doesn't seem as late as it used to be. I think also with the competitiveness of this cycle, which has now become a very known thing, students are thinking, I need to improve my position because they can see the medians are going to change, and scores that used to be almost guarantee admits at certain schools, they're not quite so guaranteed anymore. So they know they can improve their position in the application process, not just for admissions, but if you're on the wait list and you've already been waitlisted, this is a test that allows you to maybe change your status on a particular wait list. And then it's also useful for negotiation. And I've seen a lot of people say to me, they're like, well, I had somebody the other day tell me they had like a 174 and they're like, nah, I want to get a few more points and get even more money. And I was like, okay, I don't know how successful that will be, but can it hurt? No,
Right.
it can't. If you go out and you all of a sudden nail a 178, that's going to put you in a really strong position to ask for more money. Although I think schools are going to be a little tight this year with the scholarship dollars, as we will kind of touch on shortly.
Yeah, it's a buyer's market if schools are the buyers, to
Yeah.
be sure. The other thing about April, of course, number one, people are still in this weird waitlist limbo, far deeper into the cycle than is typical. It just keeps April on the table because you don't have a decision to base your new tests off of. And secondly, people know that the flex format is coming to an end. April is the penultimate flex test.
That's exactly right. Those are both excellent points. The wait list seems to be being used very heavily this year. And so instead of getting an admit the way people might have expected at certain schools, now they've been put on the wait list, and that puts them in a precarious position.
Yeah, I alluded to the end of the LSAT Flex, which obviously happens this June. The registration date for June isn't till the end of April. April 30th, I think, is the deadline for June. So if you are still kind of on the fence, you've got a little more time to decide. I think that's also the day or the day after April scores come out. So if you are taking the April test, as so many people seem to be, and you're wondering about June, you should have an April result before you have to commit to June. But June is going to be
Yeah,
a really popular test as well, I'm certain.
I believe that's the case. And we talked about this before, how they held open the deadline to sign up for the later test to be after the scores were released for April.
Yeah.
So in pretty good shape there. Well, let's talk about the main event then. And it's a question that you and I have gotten quite a bit. And we've talked about, I'd say, a fair amount, but I don't know that we've really put it in under such a precise lens as we will tonight in talking about what's happening. But the real topic of what we're going to go through is, why is this cycle so competitive? And how does it stack up a little bit to prior years? And maybe we'll even touch a little bit on what this will mean for next year's applicants. And again, it's been a recurrent thing, but the difference here tonight, I think, to some extent, is that we've pulled out the numbers in a way that I think will allow everyone to understand that this is a completely different year. It's almost like from a different planet when you break it down. And let's get into it then.
Yeah, I used the word unprecedented before, but it really stands out much more starkly when you see the numbers themselves. So there we go. And the first big thing I think to focus on or touch on is applicants themselves. This is a hugely popular cycle in terms of just the volume of people coming through trying to go to law school this fall.
Yeah, we've got more applicants right out of the gate to deal with. And then on top of that, as we'll see, they are putting out more applications per person. So that's creating this kind of extra effect. You've already got more people trying to get what is likely to be a similar or slightly larger number of spaces. But then on top of that, they're throwing in a couple extra applications. And what that's doing is, maybe they didn't apply to a certain school before, but now they're in that pool as well. And so it's kind of like a double dipping effect here between more applicants and more applications, and that is really increasing the pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about the numbers so people could really understand that, and then we'll go to the second huge driver of the competitiveness here.
Sure.
So if you look at just the applicants that are floating around out there, and we compare last year to this year, last year at this time, the number of applicants was around 47,900 or so. This year, the number of applicants is 57,700. So that's an increase of 20.5%. So you got 1/5 more people simply saying, hey, I want to go to law school this upcoming fall. So more people equals greater competition. It doesn't really matter what's going on from a credential standpoint. Most people who are applying to law school have, at least some basic viability level there. And so that's going to increase things just on the face of it because, supply and demand there. But what's happening with the application numbers?
Yeah, you referred to this before, but let's look at the actual numbers. So not only are applicants up about 20%, but they're applying to more schools, specifically in this way. Last year at this time, there were about 308,500, let's say, applications that had been submitted. This year, same time, there's 409,000. As a percentage change, that's up 32.6%. So applicants themselves up 20%, applications up 30, almost 33%.
Which, when you really kind of parse out the numbers, that's 100,000 more applications being put out. Now, one person can put out an extra 10 if they want, so that's not saying anything about the actual
Right.
people. But you got about 9,000 extra people, and each one of them putting out, 10 or 11, that adds another 100,000 in there. But overall, when you average it out, there are more applications per person than there were the prior year. So the number of people is up 20%, the number of applications is up over 30%,
Mhm.
and that's that supply and demand at work again. And if you're sitting there and you're like, crap, yeah, that's exactly what it is. You typically want to apply in a year where things are dropping, because then you become more coveted and more desirable. Just from the numbers here, what we're seeing is the exact opposite. There is an overage, a plethora of applicants out there.
Yeah.
Now, if they were terrible applicants, then that wouldn't be that big of a deal. But that's not the case.
That is
In
not
fact,
the case, no.
they're far better than maybe they've ever been. I've never seen anything like this before, and we knew it was happening. We've talked about it repeatedly. The flex bubble is what we've kind of termed it. But it's not just that there are more people applying, it's that they're applying with incredibly good scores. And that's the second driver. Scores are up, and not just by a little bit, they're up by a whole lot.
Scores are way up. Yeah. So not only are there more applicants, more applications, it went from about 6 on average per person to about 7 per person this year. I'm doing some quick napkin math, but I think that's right. But the credentials of these people are better than anything I've ever seen by a significant margin.
And I know right now some people are thinking, well, that sucks. I'm like, yes, hopefully you're one of those people who took the flex test and was able to get a great score out of it. Somebody asked me earlier today on our LSAT forum, they're like, I've heard that the flex scores are up. Is that true? And I was like, oh, it's true.
It's true.
It's undeniable. And they're like, is that a bad thing? I was like, oh, it's bad. And I laugh about it, but it's kind of like one of those crying laughs where it's like, okay, it's about to get, really challenging when you take a look at this. And one of the things that, you and I were tracking was what would happen with the February LSAT results. Would we start to see a degree of normalization with that bubble? Would it kind of like start to decrease a little bit? The bad news here is that it didn't. The good news is that there's a bunch of students that we had, and I'm certainly, out there in general, who just posted great scores on the flex, who were really thrilled by it. And I'm super happy for them. Obviously, getting that ultimately high score is what we try to do and really what our goal is. The way this test is working, though, is producing a lot more of those types of scores than anything we've ever seen before.
Yeah. I'm picturing someone listening to this in their car and already contemplating a swerve into oncoming traffic. It's not total apocalypse here. It's just changed the complexion of the way things are working, and it should change your expectations as well, as we'll touch on.
Yeah, and this data that we have, the way we've broken it down, I'm going to try to make it as clear as possible, the way that it's kind of like working out. And, my first thing was once the scores had come out for February, I immediately grabbed the data and started looking at it and compared it back to when the January LSAT scores came out, because I wanted to see what happened with the bubble. And that is unfortunately still there. For example, last January when we looked at this, we knew that scores in the upper 5 points, 175 to 180, they were already up 98.6% compared to the prior year. So when I looked at this, you want to see it either stay the same or drop a little bit, but it rose.
Yeah.
It's now up to 100.3%. And this is all the data that we pulled this weekend. And one of the things I'll mention to people is if you go look at the numbers, they do change incrementally every day. So they may not be exact, but they'll be really close. Going from 98.6% up to 100.3% probably sounds like, well, that's pretty similar. Why worried about it? But what it meant was that the February test added 70 more people in the 175 to 180 range to the applicant pool, which, again, you might think, well, on an individual test, that's not that many. It's more than expected from prior LSATs.
Mm-hmm.
More importantly is when we start making comparisons from last year at this time to what we're seeing right now. And I'll give you that comparison. Just, again, focusing on 175 to 180. This is the upper echelon of the test. You should have a relatively low number of scorers up here. Last year, after the February LSAC came out, and we took a look at that, there were 719 people who had scored in the 175 to 180 range. This year, that number is 1,440, which means we have more than doubled what we had. That's what that 100.3% means. And when you put it in that stark term, there's twice as many people with scores of 175 to 180. Let's take a look at what we see right now from scores to 170 to 174. Last year, there were 2,674 people at this point who had a score in that range. This year, 4,133. So again, you just added 1,500 more people.
Mm-hmm.
You add that to the 700 that you had, you've got 2,200 more people in the 170 to 180 range compared to just last year. Not total, in addition. And so as we look at that, if you actually break it down and you look at all scores from, say, 160 to 180, the number is actually 5,873 more scores, additional scores in that range compared to the prior year. And so that is driving law schools to be really cautious about what's happening. But that's why this cycle is so competitive. You got more people applying, putting out more applications, and you've got thousands more high scores than anything we've ever seen before.
Yeah, almost 6,000 more people at 160 or above this year, just compared to last year. 6,000 additional people trying to compete for those same well-respected, high-credential seats. That is brutal.
It's pretty brutal when you start thinking about law school class sizes.
Mm-hmm.
And we could continue to parse these numbers out. There's data in the way this bubble is working that I find really interesting, but I'm going to set it aside for a moment because as much as I like to geek out on this stuff, I don't know that everybody wants to follow me down the rabbit hole of talking about what's happening across the entire spectrum of scores and which ones are rising or falling. Let's just take that additional 6,000 scores in the 160 to 180 range. Let's take a look at some of the law schools. Jon, if you look at the law school class sizes and you think about the 6,000 extra scores in that range, what do you see there?
Well, I think the interesting way to do this is to look at the seats that they filled last year for the last admission cycle. How many people, for instance, did Yale accept and Stanford and Harvard and on through the top 10, 20, etc.? Top 14 tends to be somewhat of a strange but common marker for people. So let's do that. Let's look at the top 14 schools. Add up their seats from last year. There were a total of 4,374 seats in the top 14 schools last year filled. 4,374. And this year we've got about 6,000 more people in the 160 and up range. Additional, yeah, not just that are there already, but additional compared to last year. These numbers become extremely difficult to square. They explain the delays on law school's part, they explain the competition, but they also explain, I think, why you and I picked the songs that we did. This is tough. There are more additional scores in the 160 and up range than there were people in the top 14 schools accepted last year or attending last year.
State that again, because I think it's important to understand that it's the additional scores that actually cover those positions, not total.
Right. No, this year alone has more people added to the top 160 and up scores than there are seats in the top 14 law schools.
And that is a huge problem right there. Because I think the total number of seats in the top 14 last year was something like 4,400.
Yeah, that was the number I gave. Yeah.
Yeah, we've just added 5,800 plus people to the pool on top of what was already there. If you take a look at the top 25 law schools, the total number of seats last year was just under 7,500 available spots. If you take a look at the total number of scores in the 160 to 180 range, that number is 22,000. And you could drop 9,000 off of that, and that would take out the 160 to 164 range. That means from a 165 to 180, you're probably looking at around 13,000 scores in that range. Just again, roughly. I'm just eyeballing this. So 165 to 180, you've got a total of 13,000 scores out there. That's the highest LSAT score for these people, versus 7,500 seats in the top 25. Right there, that's the pressure point. You have so many people with so many high scores applying that you have vastly outnumbered the available spots just in those top schools right there. And that's why schools have been so slow to make decisions. They are, I mean, for lack of a better term, from their position, it's a bountiful harvest. They're like, it's just manna falling from the sky into their arms. They probably are thinking this is the greatest year in history for them because they have so many great applicants. And that, I don't know, thinking back to this might be the worst kind of like comparison from year to year that I've ever seen, going from last year to this year. Just more applicants, way more high scores. It's completely like a different cycle entirely. It's not even like I'm looking at law school admissions with this.
Yeah, I don't know that we've ever broken it down quite this far, to quite this extent, but that's because we've never needed to. It's always been far more consistent year to year than what we're seeing here. Let me put one more number out there for people. So, Dave, you just mentioned the 165 to 180 range, that real like sweet spot of competitiveness for the schools that we're talking about. In the top 25, top 24, 25 law schools last year, there were about 7,400 seats. Last year, in that 165 to 180 range, there were about 9,000 people, 9,000 scores. That's a pretty close match. This year, as you just said, over 13,000 people.
Yeah, so there's 4,000 people who previously thought to themselves, oh, I'm definitely getting into one of those schools. And now, looking at it, it's like some people are going to be crowded out who never expected that to happen. And you can see what the effect of this is from the law school perspective. There's really, to me, a couple different effects. The first one is this: they now can be far more selective because they're seeing numbers that they probably have never seen in their history in terms of like median LSAT scores. GPAs, those aren't affected by all of this. So if you have a top GPA, that's still going to help you out. But all of a sudden, if you had a 173 before and you thought to yourself, you know, I'm at Harvard's median, you're not going to be at Harvard's median. It's going to go up. The question is how much. And I would say universally at least a point, but some of these schools are going to be up 2, maybe 3 points when the medians come out, and it's going to be astonishing. And that's why it's tough to use last year's numbers. Like there's a lot of times people online are like, chance me. Tell me what my chances are of getting into Michigan. And previously, I could say with a fairly, reasonable degree of understanding and confidence, all right, this is what your chances are going to be. But any prior numbers that you're looking at are no longer valid because Michigan's not going to be, the usual 169 LSAT median. They could be 171. They could be 172.
Yeah.
I can't see it because obviously I'm not sitting at these schools. But that means that their decision-making process is going to be far more restricted than before. And so what's happening is at a school like Georgetown, there's a bunch of candidates coming in who normally would have gotten in. Now they're not so sure. So they say to themselves, maybe what we should do is put them on a wait list and see how this all plays out. Because they still have to wait for the dominoes to fall at the top. And that's the first thing that happens is that restricted decision making, more people on the wait list. The other thing I'm seeing right now is I'm starting to get messages from people who've gotten into schools who are trying to negotiate scholarships. And so far, it's been rough going. And here's the reason why. You may have gotten in, and I hope that you have, and congratulations on that. But you're now competing against other people who have numbers, and many more, just as good as yours. You're not as desirable as you were previously because there's somebody right behind you who can step in and take your place. And so the schools aren't all of a sudden rushing to match offers at the same rate that I've seen in the past. I've seen some cold, fast no's to people that I didn't expect to see. And of course, there's been some successes, but this isn't the time to start saying, all right, I'm going to jump into a negotiation discussion because a lot of schools are still sitting in the middle of this ocean and they're completely uncertain. They're waiting to see how it plays out. Applicants do not have a strong position right now,
Yeah.
both for trying to get in and for once being in to actually negotiate their position. So I know that's terrible news, and I hate being the messenger, and I know you do too, Jon, but the reality is exactly what we just described.
Yeah, it occurs to me that let me dispel one thing that has come up a few times from students who have said things to the effect of, well, yeah, of course there's more high scores, there's more people. Remember, applicants are up about 20% this year. There are going to be more results, but scores from 165 and up, they're up about 50%. From 170 and up, they're up 64%. 175 and up over 100%. 20% more applicants does not become anywhere close to accounting for those types of increases at the upper end.
That's a great point that you make. To see it is like, oh, there's more people. Yes, but the number of high scores way outstrips the increase in people. And when you start to realize that, it's like it becomes an LSAT logical reasoning problem to me. You probably construct something really evil around what's happening here. More evil than it is inherently for what's happening.
Sadly, this is not a flaw question. This is more of a must be true. There are just hard facts that we're going to have to use to make some determinations, draw some deductions.
And it'll be interesting to see what happens with law school classes as well. Some schools are not in a position where they could or really would expand their class dramatically. And different schools have, different class sizes. You look at like Harvard versus Stanford. Harvard's like 500 people in their class. Stanford's like 175.
Mm-hmm.
They are going to act a little bit differently. And Stanford could still be just as selective as they want, but they might say to themselves, we could add a decent number of seats here and not drop anything and still actually raise the standards. So we'll have to see how that actually plays out. We see 7,500 or so seats from last year in the top 25, top 26 overall. I expect that to rise because with this many good students, people are going to want to kind of like expand the class, kind of like rake it in while the going's good. But how much it expands, I don't know. Does it go to 8,500? Does it go to 10,000? Hard to know right now what happens, but I expect that they say the T6, the top 10, they're going to be very careful because what they don't want to do is expand too much, lower standards, and then see a huge rankings hit from that.
Yeah, this is one of those rare instances where expanding may not result in lowering standards. You've just got that much of a pool of qualified applicants. Qualified in terms of their numbers. That's the most I can say for them.
What it really means is that some very good candidates this year who would have been very successful in prior years are going to struggle this year. It also means that the waiting game isn't going to stop anytime soon. And I know that's terrible news because obviously we're in contact with students all the time, and I know more than a few who are just on the edge of their seats. You can't do anything but wait. Send in your letters of continued interest if you get waitlisted. Make sure to clearly signal to the school that they're a top choice of yours and all the things you would normally do. But this isn't something where you can look at last year or the year before and think, oh, everybody knew at this point. It's not going to work that way. This is going to be a long, slow cycle.
Yeah, I think if there's one takeaway from this so far is that the the truths of years past no longer hold true, frankly. Things that you're used to, historical tendencies, tradition even, all that's out the window this cycle.
This is depressing me. I wish I actually had like a full Irish car bomb here because I would take it right now.
I feel like I've got Johnny Cash on my shoulder, crooning in my ear.
It really is the Trent Reznor, version of this. Little whiny, little hurt about the whole thing.
Yeah. The natural question has come up a lot as students have learned some of this, and I don't know if they've ever got it quite so pointedly as we've just put it, but the question continues to arise as to why? What's causing this enormous flux at the top here? Why are scores inflated so much, especially at the highest levels? How have we doubled the number of 175 and up scores over the past year?
I think it's a good question, and I know that you and I are going to talk about it.
That was my segue. You're welcome.
So I think there's a lot of contributing factors. The first and biggest one, I think everyone can agree on the fact that the pandemic and the resulting quarantine that so many people went through clearly caused people to have more time and availability to sit down and actually prepare for this test. And this is just one of a number of factors we're going to mention relatively quickly here. And the more you prepare for this test, historically, the better you're going to do. And so the circumstances created an environment where people were able to kind of like hunker down and focus on preparing. And a lot of the distractions that they would have had otherwise, going out with friends, going to a movie, what have you, that didn't exist.
Right.
People who would have like run into somebody and ended up with a significant other, they didn't go out. They stayed at home, and all of a sudden they're studying because, well, I want to use my time productively. I want to do well in the LSAT. Bang. There you go. That's going to have an effect just by itself.
Yeah, I've seen dozens and dozens of comments over the last year of, I guess I'll study. What else am I going to do? And that has not always been the case historically, but the past year, if nothing's open, crack a book.
Might as well. And again, we're talking about what caused the increase, that score bubble increase.
Yeah.
So that's the first one. What do you think the second one of many causes is?
Sure. There's a handful of obvious ones, and I think we're in that category at the moment. The other one that occurs to me, and you, I'm sure, is that, look, this isn't exactly a secret, the fact that this is a competitive cycle, that people are scoring better. The extent to which might have been unknown, but the fact that it's happening, people realized. And increased competition, just the awareness of it, I think has led to a lot of increased motivation and effort. People are putting more time into this, not just because they can, because they know they have to.
Yeah, and that might not have been the case so much in May, but it is certainly the case now where everybody is aware this is competitive. A lot of the comments that I get are to the effect of, yeah, I got to increase my position. I think I have a good score, but I need to get an even better score. And that's driving those numbers ever higher.
That's right. Yeah, the very definition of good enough has changed this year.
And we're also coming out of a period where people were able to take the test an unlimited number of times.
Yeah.
So you had more opportunities. And there's certainly been a growing movement towards not penalizing people who have multiple takes. And when I say multiple takes, I don't mean 2 or 3. That's so common these days that I don't think anyone even looks at it for half a second. I'm talking about people who have 6, 7, 8. Yeah. There's even someone I'm aware of who has 9 takes who's taking it again.
Really?
Yes. I sent you the message on this because I was so astonished by it. 9 takes, has gotten into top 25 schools with money.
I remember, this is Emory, right? Isn't this the person that got into Emory?
I think that's what.
I knew there were 9 takes in a scholarship to Emory. I didn't know there was a 10th on deck. My goodness.
It's awesome, honestly, to see it because I've often, preached the idea that the number of times you take this test should be irrelevant. Law school shouldn't be looking at it. It should not matter to them. It is immaterial because there's so many factors that can affect performance. You should be able to take this test 10 times if you want to and you're financially capable of doing it. And it's just to your preference. It shouldn't make a difference whether you've taken it once or 10 times. It should be your high score and your high score only. So we know that coming out of that unlimited test cycling that we saw last May, June, July, August of 2020, right, that's going to be a situation where people are able to take the test more without any kind of penalty. Since then, it's kicked in with the testing limits. But those people are still part of this cycle and had that situation coming into it. So that's going to increase the number of higher scores as well, because the more times you take this, the better your chance of scoring more highly.
Yeah, I'm doing air quotes around free repeats for the first 4 flex tests last year. Those are the people that are in this cycle right now. A lot of those people took all 4 and then some. And that's just naturally going to increase their scores. There's a fourth thing here that I know you and I both have addressed before, but I'll re-mention it, which is that never before have I seen such just a wealth of great content available for people who are studying for this test. It seems every year the availability of materials not only grows in terms of access, but grows in terms of quality. And obviously I'm just referring to us, but well, the truth is, I mean, if you're preparing for this test, you are, it's a bonanza right now of what's out there for you to learn from and to study and to improve yourself with.
Look, 20 years ago, there just weren't that many good options.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of the reason I got into this was that I was like so distressed by how bad everything seemed from, books that were being published and some of the courses that were really popular at that particular point in time.
Yeah.
It was frustrating to me, and it was something that was a real driver in terms of my interest in doing this. And I can say that without any doubt, the circumstances they've really improved. They've changed so much. The courses that I know not to be that great, they're not that popular anymore.
Yeah.
And most of what people are looking at and kind of deciding between and working with, they are at least of a level that I can say this is way better than it used to be. And I know, just as you mentioned, from what we do, we've really tried to increase our output of free webinars that we do, blog posts that we do, even this podcast and so forth. And all that kind of adds together to create a much different situation. There's more people studying for the LSAT right now, and they have more time on their hands, and they have better material than anything that's ever been seen before overall. That's going to have an effect in the long term.
Yeah.
And sure, I think things about the test have changed as well. We've seen how convoluted reading comprehension has become, and that's the people who make this test saying, oh, we're seeing increases, we better do something about it. But all those kind of like fairly obvious reasons coalesce to create or help create this scoring bubble. But I think there's another, some people would say less obvious reason, but I think it's one of the bigger parts of this as well. You
Yeah.
want to talk about it?
We could call it less obvious. We could also call it like the elephant in the room, because there's just no denying the fact that when the test format changed last May, when they introduced the flex test, basically, that's really what kicked off this tremendous upward swing in performance for people. So there's just no way to have this discussion without touching on the nature of the flex test and what it is perhaps that it's contributed in terms of these higher scores. So let's talk a little bit about how that test has actually functioned and the consequences of it.
Yeah, especially because the flex was presented as, a viable substitute for what we will call the old LSAT.
Yeah, perfect equivalence.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a substitute that would come in and produce scores on the same scale that would be equivalent to what we saw before. And early on, we started sounding an alarm, as did a few others in this industry, saying it doesn't look like that's what's actually happening. And we were told, hey, it's gonna self-correct, that the scores will go back to normal. And I think that was well-meaning advice. They meant that. They thought that was what was going to happen. I heard a lot of quotes about the numbers of the cycle and what type of applicants take the LSAT at various times, and a lot of confidence that, hey, these numbers will come down. They never did. And in fact, as we just saw from January to February, they're getting worse in terms of the actual bubble. But it would be, I think, foolish to try to deny that if you take a test that's 5 sections and you have to go to an unknown or unfamiliar place to go take it, and you remove some of these factors, you take it from 5 sections down to 3, and then you allow people to take it at home, just those 2 things, along with the ability to choose the day and time that you take it, those things right there, that's a huge advantage for flex test takers. And I think it showed. People were able to perform in a more comfortable environment, in a more calm manner on this test, and that gave them higher scores. And that's because it looks to me like LSAC said, let's keep the scales exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
Let's keep it to what we expect it to actually be based upon all the prior testing they'd done. The problem was all the prior testing they'd done had been at universities in test centers with 5 sections, and that's not what happened here. I think if I was sitting in Newtown and we were having an honest discussion and we could speak freely, I think the people there would probably say, yeah, we should have maybe changed that a little bit and taken that into account a little bit more. I don't think they expected it to have this type of impact the way that it has. But man, there's something about sitting at your house doing something versus sitting in a cold or overly hot test center with, 50 other people that really makes a huge difference. No experimental, all these things. I mean, it really adds up in my opinion.
Yeah, I can imagine sitting there in Newtown and having that conversation too. I can also imagine stacks of Jameson bottles as we discuss exactly what's happened here, because it has not gone to plan. From the people who make this thing. I don't think I'm out of line. I certainly don't think I'm incorrect in saying that. This has turned out differently than what we were told it would be.
And I think law schools were told the same thing. And some of the effects, it's hard to measure until you actually see the numbers. Like, for example, for some test takers, having kind of like the rejuggling of the section emphasis. I mean,
Right.
previously logical reasoning was 50%. The other two sections were roughly a quarter. Now they're all a third. That disadvantages some test takers. We already know that. Some of these people who are really good at LR got hurt by this. But some of the people who are really good at logic games, they've just been advantaged by this. So you see little things in there that you might not think about so much, but logic games is a section that at the upper levels, a lot of those test takers are able to nail it.
Yeah, it's the bedrock of their score for people in the 165 and up kind of range. That's the section where they routinely feel the worst that could happen is I might miss one.
Yeah. And then you have score preview. They introduced that, and that means that a lot of scores that wouldn't really been up to par, that we might have been seeing in the lower ranges, people said, nope, not taking that, walked away from it quite wisely. I support that 100%. And so you add up all those little facts, and all of a sudden you're looking at what is essentially a different test in terms of what it's been outputting to students. And that's one, I think, big reason that we see this kind of like scoring bubble. It's just not really the same thing, although the contents and topical base of it are in fact the same.
Yeah, in fact, the reuse of tests constantly shows that they haven't actually changed the content. What we just went through really is a lot of the, I don't want to call it superficial, but maybe again the more sort of surface level obvious components. It's a shorter test. It's at home. You get to choose your day and time. There's a different proportionate emphasis on what counts towards your score, and a lot of first timers are choosing with now the information to cancel scores that they might have otherwise kept because they can see the number and know that it's not good enough. All of those are going to naturally lead to improved performance. But I have to wonder too, if on the back end of this, behind the scenes, if the mechanics of how the actual flex is being scaled might be partially to blame for this, frankly.
Well, it has to be.
Yeah.
To some extent, because if it was calibrated in exactly the same, let's put it this way, if they calibrate it the way they calibrated the old test, all those other factors are going to lead to increased scores. And it's clear that's what happened.
Right.
If it was calibrated to produce the same exact type of results, it should have been tighter scales. But we didn't really see that happen.
No, it definitely hasn't happened. If it was built around the same percentile bell curve, they would have had to tighten things up, especially at the upper levels where people seem to be continually creeping. We've only got one flex scale that's been publicly released to look at. And we've looked at it really closely. In fact, we put a whole blog post out specifically on the May 2020 test form and the scale.
You did.
Oh, well, I did, yeah.
It's a good one.
It's the royal we.
I don't know if we should be talking about the Royals after
Oh, boy.
the Oprah interview.
Well, I'm Team Meghan all the way. You've known that for a long time.
I am as well, so we're right there together.
Yeah. Pay some taxes, Queen, then maybe you get me on your side.
The richest woman in Britain.
Yeah.
Good
for
do
nothing,
what you want
Elizabeth.
anymore.
But yeah, we wrote a whole blog on that particular scale because it was astounding in many ways, especially when you compare it to the test content itself. That was a very mid-range, mid-difficulty test and a fairly loose scale, particularly up at the top. The 175 would have been about a -6. It's fairly standard. There have been a few tests, about 5 since June 2016 or so, that loose. Most have been tighter. The -9 for a 170 equates to about a -12 on the old 180 kind of thing. There's only been 3 tests since June 2016 that loose. And at a 165, a -15 last May, it's about a -20 since June 2014. So you go back, almost 7 years at this point. 6 years when the test was released. And there have been only 3 tests total that were that loose at that number, at 165 and up. So when you start to look at that scale, not only did they not tighten it, it was on the looser end historically.
Yeah, and somebody out there listening might think conspiracy theory, that, LSAC did this intentionally. I actually don't believe that at all. I think their intention was actually quite good and valid here. What they said was, we know we're using the same questions. We've tested these questions out. If this was a regular old LSAT, this is what the scale would be. I think their goal here was to keep the baseline of performance in terms of like scaling versus, the number of correct and incorrect exactly the same as it had been. That way, even though everything else had changed, there was no way you could accuse them of being unfair. And the problem is when they did that, because of all the other factors we just talked about, people started doing better and they didn't adjust downward. One of the things they told me heading into the January LSAT was we're not going to all of a sudden just suppress scores and make this test really impossible. And to their credit, they did not do that. Once they realized that it was producing a degree of inflation, they said, we're going to keep it consistent throughout this entire cycle, and we're going to continue to use the same protocols on that. And I think you can look at that and basically say they were in between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
And they chose one of the paths, and at least we know what has happened. And it's created all this inflationary pressure at the top of the applicant cycle. But we at least understand it wasn't kind of a conspiracy. It wasn't ill will or intent. It was choices that were made, logically so, just didn't play out the way they expected.
Yeah, it looked a lot better on paper than it turned out in reality, unfortunately for applicants.
Yeah,
But,
like I said,
yeah.
I think if you go back and you have a conversation with them, they'd probably say, if we could, maybe taking into account the difference in circumstances and time prepared in 3 sections, they might have changed those scales. But there was justification for those scales the way they were used, and they produced the scores that they did. And at this point, as we look at it in the aftermath, it's undeniable what happened.
Yeah.
It has occurred. So it's really a matter of like, all right, now that everything's kind of like fallen into place, let's analyze and look at what happened.
Yeah, there's one other small aspect to the way that the flex tests have been administered. And I just want to put this out there mostly, as I did before, to dispel of a misconception, which is that we know throughout the flex week now they are reusing tests, whether wholesale or piecemeal, as they reconstruct new forms out of component parts. Has that had an effect on scoring as well? Put a slightly different way, and I'm going to use the C word, a different C word. Are people able to cheat on this test, or is there some aspect where people are gaming the system?
Are you asking me that question?
I am, yeah.
There is certainly anecdotal evidence that shows that some people have tried and partially succeeded, maybe wholly succeeded. I don't know. You and I are very strong anti-cheating kind of like advocates. Our position is very clear on this and has been. I don't want to talk about cheating in general. I don't want to listen to somebody theorize about how to do it. I'm certainly not going to help anybody with that because I think it's unfair to everybody else who plays by the rules. So has that had an effect? I've certainly seen theories that say that it has. The problem is I don't have an understanding of the extent that it might have occurred. I think it's a very dangerous game to play. I know that they actively look to stop cheating. If you get caught cheating, you're done. You're not going to law school. They have that power to stop you right there and dead in your tracks. So strongly recommend that anybody who's like, well, maybe, immediately say, well, maybe not.
Right.
But I don't know that it's actually had an effect. The reuse of the content, it could. I mean, I'm not going to deny the fact that people can share information and what they do when they're texting each other or on some kind of like private chat. Who knows?
Yeah,
hard to say.
My suspicion is that this has been minimal, if anything. But at the same time, I mean, it's worth discussing because it keeps coming up. But I think you handled that well. As well as you can. I mean, it's a black box.
Yeah, how you can't prove it one way or the other. I can't see into it. I don't really know. Is it possible? For sure. Do I understand the extent of it? No. I know that people don't approach me about cheating, which is great. They don't ask me to be involved with it. Whereas in the early days of me doing this, I got offered some ridiculous amounts to take the test for people. And I was like, you are out of your mind, friend. It's never going to happen. So that at least no longer happens. I think most people understand that we're very clearly anti-cheating and wouldn't take it very well.
Yeah, it's not worth it. Certainly not worth it for us, but really not worth it for anyone.
Honestly, no.
So we talk about all of these things maybe behind the causation behind this score bubble, which again is undeniable at this point. The next 2 questions that I have, and they're really kind of a pairing. What do you think LSAC's going to do about this, if anything? And what does it mean? And we'll wrap up maybe with this. What does it mean for applicants this cycle and next? What does this mean for people? All of this data and bad news.
Well,
let's start with LSAC.
Let's start with what LSAC should or will do about it. And they've already taken the big step.
Mm-hmm.
we know that in August, the test will change. They're going to add in that 4th section. And it's interesting because it goes back to being called the LSAT. They dropped the LSAT flex. And I can't help but want to call it the new LSAT.
Right.
But I'm gonna not use that phrase too much. But it's really confusing to talk about the old 5-section test, then a 3-section flex test, and then a 3+1 new LSAT format. It's hard to distinguish between those. And I'm not just gonna whitewash it and say, oh, they're all the same. They clearly are not. What do I think is going to happen? With that new test, I think they're going to probably restrict scales a little bit and be a little bit more attentive to that aspect of it. I think through the remaining flex tests, it will stay exactly the same, which means that if you are thinking about taking one of the next 2 tests, I would recommend that you do that.
Yeah.
Because law schools will be in a position where next year they'll start, I expect, getting lower scores, or what I would call more normalized scores. So if you can get a high score on record, do it now. But I think that's the big change, is adding that experimental is going to be a position where it's going to put people, that's going to drop scores a little bit. It's additional time. It's additional uncertainty. I don't think it really helps. They still have all sorts of positives. They get to take it at home. They're now going to get a break, these kinds of things. But I think that was a big move that they made because they knew they had to do something. One of the possibilities was them just ignoring it and hoping for self-correction. And I think that was the attitude they took last year. They had reasons to do that. They've been explained to me multiple times. And I may not have agreed with all of them then. I certainly don't agree with all of them now. But I understood their reasoning and could see why they thought that was the case. So I don't think that they're going to just let it kind of passively move forward and do the exact same thing. That format changes the first kind of signal.
Yeah. Could you feel that just now, by the way? That was a lot of people pausing this to go sign up for June. That's what just happened. For good reason.
Well, I don't think
it's
it's
the last shot
at
this flex. No, it's a great idea.
Well, can you imagine this? Even if you're a sophomore in college and you're thinking, I'm going to apply to law school in a couple of years, I'm like, if you can prepare right now and do well, I would take this test. It is advantageous. It's been proven. It's clear that they are not putting some new restrictive tightened scale on these recent tests, which was, to be honest, a legitimate fear that I had last fall.
Mm-hmm.
And I will credit LSAC on this. I talked to them about it. I was like, look, this seems like it could happen, and in fact seems like inevitable. And they said, we will not do that. We will not mess with the integrity of the test scaling. And so I have to give them credit. They said they wouldn't, and by all apparent reports and data analysis, they did not do that.
Yeah. Again, they said they wouldn't based on the expectation that throughout the cycle and deeper into it, these numbers would level out. They haven't. They've gone in the opposite direction. But I suppose, to their credit, they've stuck to their guns in terms of keeping things consistent.
Look, they saw the same numbers that we did after the January LSAT. If you were going to do it, you would do it right in February. That didn't happen. We can see the numbers have actually puffed up a little bit more. And that tells me that their statements and their intent here is to honor what they said, which is, nope, we're not going to change it. We're in this cycle. We're going to keep it consistent. Now, that takes us through April, and I think everybody in April can say, all right, I've got another fair shot at this. Give it your best, because this is one of the last 2 opportunities you're going to get in this 3-section test, and then it's gone forever.
Let's hope it's gone forever. It would take pandemic round 2 for this to ever come back somehow.
Don't talk about that,
I can't jinx it.
We don't talk about the pandemic round, really not 2, but 22.
Yeah. Oh, God. But no, I don't think we'll ever see a 3-section test again. So, again, now's the time to take advantage because time is running out. Do you think, there are other ways that they could potentially combat this, so to speak. You could tighten the scales, certainly. We don't see them doing that yet. Maybe starting in August. That's too far away to predict.
I will, though.
Okay.
I think they will bring the scales in a little bit in August.
I'm in a weird position on this because on the one hand, it sounds bad to say I hope they do. But on the other hand, they've got to somehow shift this bubble back towards the middle. The bell curve is, as I've said before, it looks like a cresting wave at the moment.
And that's a problem.
Yeah, it's more like a triangle.
Yeah, it's so difficult on a law school, which had this expectation of these are our medians. We know that students in here we have a good shot at. Now all of a sudden it's all wacky. They're looking at it and somebody was saying, I have a 173. I should be getting into Harvard. I was like, in the past, that was more likely. First off, no one ever should be getting into Harvard. You're fortunate to get into any of those schools at that level. But 173 and a really good GPA puts you in the running. You've got a great chance. I was like, that's not the case anymore.
Yeah.
To me, it's more like 175 for Harvard at this point. And that's tough because you go in thinking, well, this always has been the case. And without realizing it, without even seeing it, the ground is shifting under your feet. And that is distressing to everybody. And I think it's really putting a lot of pressure on law schools too. It's a bonanza, yes, but it is also fraught with the fear of making a mistake, of accepting somebody who you didn't have to this year but would have in prior years, and then losing relative position to your competing law schools.
Yeah, 173 is the new 170 this year, which is a bit glib, but it's kind of true. Cash is the new Resner, 173 is the new 170. The world's upside down.
I don't know about the Cash Resner thing, but I get your point about the 173 is the new 170. It certainly feels like you've moved up that floor.
Yeah.
And I hate that because it's so easy to say to people, hey, get in the 170s and your chances are amazing. They're still amazing. All right, let's be honest about this. It's just tougher this year. And I think what we're going to start to see towards the end of the cycle is some people aren't going to like their results and they're going to drop out. They're going to get into a school that they thought was a safety school, and that's really the only school that they get into, and they're going to be like, no, I'm not playing this. I'm going to come back next year or the year after when I expect the situation to be better. We'll talk about that briefly.
Yeah, let's touch on that towards the end, because that's important. Yeah, what happens going forward? Two things that I don't think are going to happen going forward, still to do with the test itself and LSAC. I don't see any indication that they're planning to change the content being tested. Because again, that's been a sort of simmering suspicion for people. Talk about conspiracy theories, like, are they going to start introducing crazy games? I hear people say this after every test, where they're like, this was unlike anything I've ever seen, this was brand new. And I'm like, dude, that was February 2014. That's 6 years old, 7 years old. Nothing new about it.
That's the exact thing I was going to say.
Yeah.
I saw a ton of people after the February tests complaining about the games were unlike anything and they'd done every single game. I was like, dude, this test has been used like 10 times. It's from February of 2014. It is about as standard as a section as they can make because they keep reusing it. There's a reason they do that. It's not crazy and wild.
Yeah.
But to their, kind of like defense, I will say that anybody taking an LSAT under time pressure, everything looks weird and hard and strange and like you've never seen it before. So if you're one of those people and you're like, are they ripping on me? No, I'm actually defending you here because I have heard this for years. People take the test. It's such a weird, mind-bending experience and so pressurizing that nothing looks normal.
Yeah, I wouldn't discount the emotional response. I'm just saying objectively it is true that they're not doing anything new.
Correct.
So what about the test itself? I mean, are we looking at a near future, where they could, say, replace games with something else, or they could change the way that logical reasoning works? Somebody said to me the other day, if they wanted to make it harder, they'd only give us 30 minutes instead of 35.
Don't make suggestions like that.
I was like, first of all, you're a masochist.
Quiet down. Don't give them ideas. Let's talk about logic games for just a moment.
Okay.
We know that the logic games are supposed to go away at some point. They're supposed to be changed. In some way, due to the Angelo Bino lawsuit of a couple of years ago. My understanding is that if that's going to happen, it won't happen before 2024 at the earliest. So there were some lawsuit considerations there. I've talked about this before with the Department of Justice and some of the consent decree issues that are floating around there. I don't know the exact timeline of what they're doing, but I know based upon my conversations with them that I don't see anything prior to 2024. Now, when we reach that, I don't know what they're going to do. Obviously, I expect we'll hear some updates in the coming months if there are going to be changes. They usually are very good about giving advance warning these days about something new is coming. They haven't always been that good. So let's hope that they continue on with the good side of kind of like communications here. But I think that could be a change. But I'm telling you, logical reasoning and reading comprehension are not going away from this test. They are way too central to the process of being a lawyer and a law student, and they are very standardized and normalized in terms of how they are made. They're used on a bunch of different tests. The people who make the LSAT do an incredible job with high quality questions, nuanced questions in logical reasoning and reading comprehension. These sections aren't leaving. Whatever happens with logic games, whether it stays or whether it's replaced by something, who knows? I don't know how you test analytical reasoning that way. I haven't really started to look into it, but I will. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that's a harder section. Nobody wants that. I don't know if it's an easier section. That's not even, you don't necessarily want that either. You want something that separates people, but is still indicative of a certain type of skill.
Right.
You
Yeah,
don't
I'm,
want
I'm
to
not
chin
even
that
gonna.
quant.
Yeah, I'm not even gonna begin to tread the path of that speculation. Maybe it's algebra. I'm not going down that. But
That would suck.
as for anyone listening to this right now, assuming you're not looking 3 or 4 years into the future, the LSAT is exactly what you're looking at present for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, when they introduced that test in August of this year, and it is the 3 scored sections plus 1 experimental, I think we're going to be seeing that for a couple of years, minimum.
Yeah.
So there won't be any change. They want a period of consistency. They have said this, that it's been such a strange period here that more so than anything, they just like to see constancy for a while. Because it's work. It's a lot of work for us to even track these changes. Think how much work it is for them to be like, now we got to change this. The pandemic followed on the heels of a major change to the digital format. And now they got to make another change. It's like, I think sometimes there's like change fatigue, certainly here with us,
know, I'm
and
feeling
definitely
it.
with them.
Yeah. I will say one of the upsides of the reintroduction of an experimental section is we get something of a preview of potential changes, because that is largely how they can begin to dip a toe in the water of difference, is introduce one game on an experimental section that's got kind of a weird vibe or feel to it. Like they made me draw a map. What's that about? I don't know.
It's like
I'm not suggesting that's
1992 is
gonna.
what.
I'm not trying to freak anybody out. They're like, oh man, I'm a terrible artist. Don't worry. But these are, again, this is what the experimental section is designed to be, is an ability for them to experiment. So we are going to probably get a preview of any upcoming changes well in advance, just naturally as people take August and beyond tests. That's my suspicion, my guess.
Yeah. And just keep this in mind when we talk about logic games and possible changes, that's not something that would be previewed in experimental sections. They will not introduce some kind of new question type or format that you've never seen in an experimental. Experimental sections are solely for testing items that will appear on the test, the current version of the test in the future.
Yeah.
So it would be regular logical reasoning, regular reading comp, regular logic games. You're not going to all of a sudden see something new where you're like, what was that? Where it's not even a game or an LR or anything like that.
Right.
That's not how this works.
I mean, more, thematic changes, nuanced, subtle differences in themes or emphasis and stuff. You're not all of a sudden going to have to be fold origami or something. That would
you
be a great
mentioned
section
mapping
on the
games.
test. That would be fantastic. The origami section.
Here is a swan.
Yeah, make a duck.
Here's me at a bar having a beer. No, but seriously, you mentioned mapping there, and I was like, it's funny to me how they like move away from certain concepts, because mapping, like I said, it's like 1992 all over again when there was a bunch of mapping games in the early 90s, and then they got away from it. You know, same thing with family tree games. They used to have a ton of those in the 1980s, and they don't do that anymore. And for me, I was very thankful that they got rid of family tree games, because I don't have a big family. I don't know what a great grandnephew is, and I don't want to know. So those games were hard. They're not going to do anything like outrageous. You may see mapping on the test in the future. That wouldn't surprise me. But at least as far as like the changes that they'll make, it'll maintain within the expected boundaries of what we see in any of these sections currently. So let's move on. Let's talk about some of the takeaways for current applicants as well as applicants for the next cycle.
Okay, yeah, start at present. What do you do if you're an applicant right now? And obviously, this is going to change a little bit depending on what your position is. If you're sitting on wait lists and feel like you've still got a reasonable shot, a lot of this may not matter for you. This is more about people who still have either the ability or the intention of influencing their pathway forward.
If you're in the cycle currently and you haven't been admitted anywhere, you've maybe got some wait lists or you're just waiting, it's tough going out there. You have no choice but to be patient.
Yeah.
That's the first piece of advice. Is a lot of people have said, well, I would have known by now at this point of the year. I'm like, right, last year you would have. That's not this year. This is an entirely different cycle. Be patient and wait. Really, to me, right now, no news is good news. So many people have been put on wait lists already and are now in kind of like these big piles where it's really hard to discern what's going to be happening. If you have applied and it wasn't last week and you're in a position where you're just waiting, that means you're in consideration. They are looking closely at you, and they have hard decisions here to try to discern from one person to another. It also means that if you are sitting in that pool and you had signed up for April for some reason, keep studying. Keep preparing for that test, because it might be the type of exam where if you can add a few more points to your score, it could be decisive in that kind of like end of April, early May kind of period.
Yeah, we keep coming back to the words like normal or what to expect. I think people have to just look at this cycle in isolation, frankly. We're in a strange little bubble right now where the old norms don't apply. There is no normal here.
There isn't. You got longer decision times that are certainly occurring right now. You've got more confused decisions because there's many more of them to be made. So just be aware of that. Be patient. Take your time. Understand that the law schools are trying to do what they can to kind of like accommodate everybody and make the best decisions for them. Also, be aware the old numbers, the old medians on the LSAT side, they don't apply anymore. The GPAs do.
Yeah.
All right. So that's actually really, useful. You've got half the equation. But as we said earlier, median scores at most law schools, if not every single one of them, will rise this year. Especially for the schools who had medians that were 160 or above, they're rising. There's zero doubt about this. I'll be very surprised if I see a school that all of a sudden kept the same median as last year, because I'll wonder what rock they've been under for the last year.
Yeah, this is a T-ball. How'd you strike out?
If you ever watch little kids play T-ball,
right, yeah.
They don't let them strike out, but boy, some of them would.
But yeah, again, this is what I keep having to tell people over and over. I feel like a recording at this point of just, this year's different. This year's different.
Technically, now you are.
I suppose I am now recording.
But don't expect the normal outcomes that you saw in prior years. So everything's slower. It's going to be harder. You're going to have to show more patience. This cycle will probably last longer than we saw in prior years too.
Oh yeah, deep into the summer. I think June tests are still going to be viable options for people to start in the fall.
I think they will make some decisive moves off the wait list at that particular point and say, all right, you move up to the top because of your June LSAT result. And the last thing is that, at least as far as the financial negotiations, be careful, because law schools aren't in a position where they really have to do a whole lot of negotiating. They're completely in the power position with the circumstances that we've just outlined earlier in this episode. And so I think we're probably going to try to do an episode next time on financial negotiations. Started kind of like putting together some thoughts on that, and I think it would be helpful. So that's kind of what our intention is right now. But at least if you're in this cycle, just go easy with it and don't try to force your hand, because your hand is really weak. You may not realize it. You may be looking at last year's numbers thinking, I'm 2 points above their median, and they might be looking at you saying, no, you're 1 point below our median now. So take it really easy with the financial negotiations, and hopefully there'll be more on that in the next episode or a future topic.
Yeah, I like that discussion. And again, this year is going to take on a very different tone than it would have in the past. But I'm used to things being different, I suppose.
Different is good, and I've started reaching out to a few law school deans and saying, hey, tell me how it's going with the negotiation situation. And it's early and they're busy, so the usual response is, when I have time. And I'm willing to accept that. So hopefully we'll have a few insightful comments from various deans who can shed some light on what's happening and maybe the best way to go forward on that negotiation stuff.
Yeah, I almost said before that I don't envy law schools in this cycle, and then I realized what a stupid comment that would have been. It's like feeling bad for the guy at the restaurant where everything looks delicious. That's kind of what this is.
Or the guy who ordered every entree and just can sample whatever he wants.
Right. So that's what this is. It's an overwhelming buffet of choices, frankly.
So let's talk about not the applicants in the current cycle, but the applicants who are going to be in the next cycle. Mm-hmm. What do we see happening next year?
Well, I think a lot of the people in this cycle are going to default to people in the next cycle, as you mentioned before. Some of the results this year are just going to be so unsatisfactory for people that they don't really have much choice but to wait, understandably so. But
Well,
yeah,
and let me sidebar that, because if you're a person who expected to get into the T14 and you discover that the best school that you got into was, say, the T20, T25 range, you might think to yourself, I'd rather wait it out a year and come back and see if I can get back close to the T14, if not back into it. So I think a lot of people are going to be faced with that decision, and we may see that push off. And that's going to have an effect on next year's cycle, which we'll talk about. So I'm sorry, didn't mean to
no,
interrupt
not at
there, but I
all.
thought that
No,
was a
I mean,
useful
if
point.
anything, what you've suggested a little bit in that, perhaps the advantage of waiting is that next year's cycle may not be quite so bad, quite so brutal or competitive as this.
I think it'll return towards normal, but it won't be normal.
That's very well put. I didn't know what you were going to say there. You used towards, and that was the right choice.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be as tough as this year, but I think it'll be tougher than last year.
Okay.
And I think that'll probably be as they get the LSAC control on the scoring a little bit more and the test changes. That'll be the first thing. So medians will be inflated, but people looking back at this year will be like, oh my God, I need a 175 or 176 for Harvard. And then they'll be like, no, now it's down to 174.
Right.
It'll be that kind of scenario. So it'll start to return. And part of the problem is that people from this year will be in next year's cycle because they'll say, nope, didn't like it.
Exactly.
I'm going to wait a year.
Yeah, and we mentioned before that there were in the top 26 or so, about 7,400 seats or so last year, and our expectation that number is going to increase. If it does, this year could serve as something of a clearinghouse for some of this.
Could be nice.
Yeah.
The fewer people from this year with inflated scores in next year's cycle, the better off it'll be for next year's cycle.
Precisely right. Yeah. That said, if you can take the June LSAT, again, broken record, take it. You're running out of opportunities to jump on this opportunity, frankly.
It's the last flex.
I know.
It's
I'll
like
miss
the
it.
last
Part of me
gunman.
will miss it.
I don't know if I will. I guess I will. I'm really happy that the flex exists because otherwise I think it would have been a really tough year for law school applicants in general. And it is anyway, but it would have been a very different and I think more confusing year. So I said this on prior episodes that I'm remain impressed by the fact that they created this test in such a short time and that they were able to put it together. Now that I understand the decisions that were made, I can at least assess it and honestly say that it was an impressive feat and the goals that they had were really good. And I've said this before, I'll be the first person to criticize them when they do something that I think is unreasonable, but I think it also means that it's fair to be the first person to compliment them when they do something really well. And creating this test in the way they were able to pull it off, despite all the problems that we saw from many people, it was something that really helped them out. So credit there where credit is due.
I guess part of what I'll miss about the flex is the lack of an experimental. It meant that anytime somebody reported something, you at least knew it was real. And for our purposes, man, that took a lot of mystery out of it.
Yeah, we'll talk about that and how that will affect tests in August and later at a later date, because I think that's going to have an impact on certainly how we do things and just even this podcast and some of the episodes that we have and what we're capable of talking about, because there's about to be a period of far greater uncertainty in this kind of like post-test days. And I think the flex students, to some extent, have really been able to benefit from the absolute total certainty of knowing that everything that they had on their test was real and to really be able to assess their performance. When that experimental comes back, that certainty is, it's gone for one of the sections. 50% of the test you're going to know, but if you had two logic games, you're going to be wondering which one's real, and I'm going to tell you right now, it's going to be really hard to know. Really, really hard to know. So that's a conversation for another day.
Oh, now I'm sort of feeling the theme music. Well done, buddy. You're depressing me now.
Sorry.
It's all right. Medians will stay up, but they should level out a little bit. We'll find that a new normal exists. This year is going to be an extreme version of it. Last year is going to be the other extreme. I think what we'll see next year and beyond is probably going to be a little more representative of what to expect in the future. All of that said, it's still going to be more competitive than years past, as you've mentioned. So maybe the most important thing of all when it comes to what to do, what to expect, is, as I said before, the definition of good enough has changed. You simply can't get by on a score at or near past medians, at or near your best. You have to be your best. You have to exceed your best, which means you've got to put more effort, more time. You've got to invest more in the preparation for the LSAT. There's just no getting around it.
And I'll take it a step further. Certainly for the LSAT, you need to make sure that you put your time and resources into doing that, which is an easy enough and, as you would say, glib thing for us to say, given that's what we do. But I wouldn't even stop there with the LSAT. I'd say it goes to everything.
Mm-hmm.
If you're still taking classes in college, make sure you nail them. Extracurriculars that are out there, if you need to bulk that up and make that section a little bit more robust for yourself, do that. It's a higher bar that you're going to have to jump over. And look, nobody out there is like, well, I was trying to do the minimum. You and I do sometimes, but not with something like this where it's like a competition. This is something where you're really now being judged on a higher standard. And so you have to look further beyond yourself on all levels: grades, LSAT, extracurriculars, the essays that you write, for your personal statement, the YX essay you might write for a
Right.
school, the letters of recommendation. You really have to make it refined as possible. And obviously, if somebody's like, well, how do I do that? I would just say I've done a million webinars about things like personal statements and letters of recommendation. Check our blog. There's a million things there
Mm-hmm.
about applying and how to make yourself look as good as possible. But it's going to be tough next year, just not as tough as this year. But that's because this year is the worst ever, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. And if there's a wave towards the top of the scoring range, you have to ride that wave. You have to be on it. Otherwise, you get left behind, frankly. So, as I continue to say to people, do everything in your power to get every possible point. It's no longer like, maybe a 171 is good enough. Like I said, that term doesn't really apply anymore.
Yeah, it's just like the comment I made about Michigan before. 169 was kind of like they love those scores.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's how they feel this year. I think they're more like 172 is the score we like more.
Yeah.
And that's frustrating for people who had exceeded 169 and thought Michigan was a realistic target for them. I saw a ton of people get waitlisted to them that I previously was like, you would have been in last year. But they're just pushing it off. And it's not to say they won't get in, because schools will use their wait list just like they do every year. It's just going to take time for that to come up. And that means for some people listening here, you may be sitting here in a couple of months still with uncertainty.
Right.
And for you, I'm sorry. I wish it was different.
It's not all doom and gloom, but this is definitely not the cheeriest episode we've ever put out.
No, I do need to go drink. Forget it all.
I'm gonna, cheers to the experimental section. You jerk. That's the knife I need twisted today. Thank you.
Well, you know what I said to you this weekend when you and I were putting this together, and I was pulling up the numbers on it. I was like, this is bad. This is even worse than I think I had actually crystallized it. And I knew it was bad. I was like, this is going to be a depressing episode, because as we talk about this, it's going to become crystal clear that it's not a feeling, it's a reality, and a hard, cold numerical reality that's unavoidable.
Yeah.
Anything to add to that?
Facts are facts, That's just the way it goes. I will say there is still a lot of great opportunity. I mean, one of the things we touched on before, and I'll end with the reemphasis of it, is your ability to improve on this test has never been potentially greater, given what's out there, given what's available to you. Take advantage. Take advantage of everything, because now more than ever you need the extra points.
You do, and keep in mind, there are advantages to this test format. If logic games was your weakness, it's one of those things where you can actually get out and you have enough time to prepare for it going forward. There are things about this test that are advantageous. You just need to get out there and find them and use it to your advantage.
Exactly.
All right, on that note, let's call it a day. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. If you've enjoyed it, and maybe this was the hardest episode to enjoy in a couple of months, please leave us a comment, give us a rating as well. And if you have any questions for a future episode, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of Jon and myself, thanks so much for listening. I hope this wasn't too depressing. Keep your chin up, keep waiting, it'll all work out.